I've been given the incredible task of summarizing everything we know about the science of early childhood in 15 minutes for you. I will do my best. But let me just kind of start, give you a little bit of my journey. For me, this caring about early childhood as a foundation was an obvious moral responsibility before I knew anything about the science. And it's hard to imagine why we don't all automatically start with this commitment to young children. As I grew up a little bit professionally, I realized I should talk about return on investment and that this really is about the future of a healthy, sustainable society everywhere in the world. And then when those two alone seemed to be not enough to convince everyone, I started to hang around with some very smart scientists and learned a lot about the science of early childhood. And really where we are right now, and what I'm going to summarize for you very briefly, is this incredible untapped power of aligning advances in the underlying biology of early development and lifelong health and well-being, and the lived experiences of families raising children, the lived experiences of governments and not-for-profit agencies in the voluntary sector, to actually have to deal with the realities every day. And I have to say that the science is very compelling, but the science doesn't tell people how to raise their children. It tells people why what they're doing is good for their children or why what they need help with is important. So I don't want anyone to leave here today thinking that raising children is primarily a science. It's a very challenging art. But there's a lot of science to help us with this. And what we really need to do is achieve greater impacts. The early childhood field is not new. It's been around for a long time. We've made a lot of progress, but we have a long way to go. So what I want to do now is first give you basically introduce three core concepts of what is the old science of early childhood development from a biological point of view. By old, I mean like 20 years old. Okay, and there are basically three concepts that have been around and have really shaped this field for a long time now. The first is the notion that early experiences literally shape the architecture of the developing brain. This is not a random process, so we're all genetically programmed to accomplish the basic skills of life. But how those genes are activated and how biology works is very much influenced by the environment in which children are raised, very much influenced by the relationships they have. This is not an automatic pilot, and the one thing that everyone needs to keep in mind is that what happens early is very important, but it is not highly deterministic. It doesn't exactly mean this is the way it's going to be for the rest of your life. So think about this as either building a strong foundation that you can build on for the rest of your life, or having a weak foundation that we're going to have to spend a lot of time trying to correct or build. And it's always better to get things right the first time than try to fix them later, but it's never too late. My colleague will talk about that in our lifetime perspective. The second issue is this importance, this critical importance of the relationships between children beginning at birth and with the important people in their lives. It starts with parents. It's not restricted to parents. It can be extended family members. And what the academics call contingent reciprocity, we've translated for the general public as the serve and return interaction that happens between adults and the babies they care for. And people who've never taken a course in child development instinctively cannot help but respond with a smile when a baby smiles at you. If a baby is cooing, you make baby sounds back, and nobody told you to do that. It's kind of built into our biology, and that's what builds strong brain circuits from the bottom up. But the danger is the impact of excessive chronic stress activation. And by the way, whenever the word stress comes up, the goal here is not to protect children from any stress. That's not what life is all about. The issue is to kind of be able to have a manageable toleration for stress in your life. But what we've learned over the years, and the science is really clear, that when there's chronic activation of the stress response system most of the time over a prolonged period, and those of you who have young children, please do not go home tonight and worry that you're not paying attention for 5 minutes and your child is experiencing toxic stress. That's not the way it works. We're talking about this basically being the way your life generally is all the time. And don't be worried about that either. We're all stressed all the time. But that this chronic stress activation basically can disrupt the development of brain circuits at a time where they're first forming in all parts of the brain, some particularly sensitive parts of the brain where the early fear circuitry is developed, or where your ability to focus your attention. And I could go on and on, but I don't have a lot of time to do that. But when you think about children who've experienced significant adversity, come to school and they have trouble paying attention, and they have trouble kind of controlling their impulses, It's not about a bad attitude. It may have something to do with the fact that basic circuitry was disrupted at a time when it was most importantly developed. So these are the three core concepts of what have been the kind of underlying science of early childhood that's informed policies and programs and general public education about this for about 20 years. One simple summary of all of this is why the early experiences are so important for the developing brain is that there's a conceptual curve of what plasticity looks like. Plasticity refers to the malleability and the adaptability of the brain to kind of learn new things. And so I know you're all looking for your age. So I know that. Me too, right? But here's the important message. The brain is optimally plastic at birth because it has most of the cells it will have, not all, but most of the cells it will have for a lifetime, but very few of the connections. And it's the connections among those cells that make the brain work. And you can see that the plasticity drops dramatically in the early childhood years because you start with no connections and you're building a lot of connections based on the brain reading the environment and trying to figure out how to optimally adapt to the environment. There's an environment of uncertainty and unpredictability and violence. The brain is adapting, assuming it's always going to be that way. But then as time goes on, it's less malleable. It never goes to zero. The slide is only so long. If there were a 100-year-old person sitting in this audience and you learned one thing from the entire day, went home, went to sleep, got up tomorrow and remembered it, your brain made a new connection, right? So it never stops, but it's harder. Because the flip side of that is from a biological perspective, the ability of the brain to adapt at physiological costs over time goes up because it's harder to change. This is the biological explanation of you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Or we're a couple of months away from the new year. Many of you, like I, will make resolutions to eat better and exercise more. And the fact that we don't succeed is not because we're not motivated, it's because it's hard. It's really hard to change. So I'm going to fast forward now to where we are in terms of where the science is today, because there's some new, science doesn't stand still, and there's a revolution going on right now in molecular biology and neuroscience. And there are three additional concepts that I want to share with you that build on those old concepts. It doesn't replace them. The old concepts are as rock solid as they've ever been. The first is the fact that all multiple biological systems are interacting with each other. It's not just about the brain. The immune system, metabolic systems are also reading the environment, also figuring out how to optimally adapt. So this is as much, we used to focus primarily on early learning, readiness for school, still very important, but now we also focus on these are the foundations of lifelong physical and mental health, all for the same pound that you invest. The second concept, a critical one, this is one we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about and all of us need to embrace. This importance of variation and sensitivity to adversity, diversity of experiences and exposures. So we are not all the same. And everything that we study that talks about what is the average child like at a certain age, what's the average response to an intervention or a policy, masks the fact that some children are exquisitely sensitive to the environment and some are relatively insensitive and kind of roll along with the punches. And the ones who are most sensitive in tough environments are the ones who get into the most trouble. But they also are the ones who are the most creative in a good environment. They're the ones because they're very sensitive to what's going on. So variation is something we have to take into account and expect variation. If you grew up in poverty, there are always the stories of people who have overcome incredible diversity and those who have not. And that's biology and that's human development. It's about variation. And then the third is that place matters. Place matters in terms of where you live, in terms of the protective effects of assets and opportunities and the disruptive burdens of hardships and threats. So I'm going to move quickly now to kind of superimpose these new concepts on top of the still very valid concepts and share with you that, and what great timing, Your Royal Highness, to put the emphasis on social and emotional development, because from a science point of view, the early childhood field is at an inflection point right now. Real opportunity based on new science and lived experiences to say that we have to expand the mindsets that guide how we think about investments in early childhood and social and emotional development. Its time has come. And the fact that there are champions, new champions, is really seizing that opportunity. So what's the difference between the old science, which is still very valid, and this kind of new science of early childhood development. So it's still about early brain development. In fact, it's even more about early brain development than it's ever been in an environment of relationships. And I have to control myself to not say but, and it's also connecting the brain to the rest of the body in a much broader ecosystem and recognizing that it's not just about the brain, even though it's very much about the brain. Second, it is still about providing enrichment for developing minds, the importance of talking to children and reading to them and providing a variety of learning experiences in a safe and stable and predictable environment. And it's also about protecting developing brains and bodies from the biological disruptions of excessive adversity. And you mentioned just a few of them. Your Royal Highness, poverty, violence, mental illness in a family that just create tremendous challenges for children growing up. It's still about investing in evidence-based programs. Last time I checked, there is no International Association for the Prevention of Evidence-Based Programs. It's also about tailoring best practices of state-of-the-art to address variation and effectiveness. If we are going to make a bigger impact at all the things we do, we have to stop asking, does this work? We have to start asking, for whom is this making a big impact, and figure out how to scale that, and ask, equally important, for whom is this making small or no impact, and figure out what to do differently, instead of hoping the funders don't find out that not everybody benefited from an intervention. This is a sign of a very healthy field that is always trying to be better. It's still about strengthening caregiver-child relationships. There is no way that the importance of relationships will ever disappear from the short list of what matters. It will always be there because it is real and it is built into our biology. But it's also about everyone working together to assure that all families raising young children live in an environment that supports healthy development. Nobody raises children by themselves. If you're economically secure and well-educated, you purchase the services you need and you get it from a community that is rich in resources. And if you're poor or you're a victim of structural inequities, you are missing a lot of those things that everybody needs, but you don't have the resources to get it. So we can't put everything on relationships, because when problems don't get better, then we blame it on relationships. We say, well, maybe these parents didn't do a good enough job, and that's not what's going on. It's the environment in which people are living. I'm going to leave you with three slides. You know, when you're an academic, you're constantly living in fear of being irrelevant in the real world. So what we do work very hard on, is to try to distill a lot of complicated science into simple principles that are not simplistic and that really capture the complexity of the science. So there are basically three principles that come now from this kind of expanded science, but it's building on the old as well. The first is we have to employ multiple approaches to enhance responsive relationships. So for many people, it's enough to just provide information and provide supports and we're home free. But there are circumstances, it has nothing to do with how much people love their children. But a young single mother with depression cannot just be expected to be able to be responsive to her child all the time because she has an illness, not because she doesn't care about her child, or addictions or other circumstances, or people who are coping day to day with barely having the resources to keep a roof over their heads and to buy sufficient food, are not free from the drain on daily energy and resources. Will leave less time to be engaged with what people say, why aren't you interacting more with your child? So we need to not only strengthen relationships, but we need to recognize the variation in needs of how to do that. The second, I'm going to leave this to the rest of my colleagues who are presenting in the working groups, about the importance of strengthening skills for a diversity of contexts. What we consider to be important skills in some contexts are different in other contexts. Children living in very unstable environments grow up being hypervigilant and having difficulty focusing their attention because you never know what's going to happen next. Those are very adaptive skills for that kind of an environment. So we have to be not too narrow in terms of what we call skills at a social and emotional development. My goodness. I mean, I have to just say it, kind of like to use this a lot. For those wherever you work, whenever things are not going well in the office or in the workplace and things are falling apart, it is a huge challenge. How many people say, I wish everybody here had 5 more IQ points? No. You say, I wish everybody here knew how to work together. I wish people could kind of, separate their own problems from what we're trying to do together. skill to development. These are not 21st century skills. I think they were always important, but the 21st century is a very different context. And the third issue, obviously, is we have to reduce sources of excessive adversity on families raising children, because people who have all the resources have a really hard job raising their kids. This is not completely easy all the time. So reducing adversity as opposed to helping bolster the ability to cope with adversity. And I'm going to stop right here because there's so much else to talk about this morning. But let me end where I began, and thank you very much for the honor of being part of this symposium and this wonderful campaign.